if you flip that brain picture back over to the St. Thomas Aquinas picture, that St. Thomas Aquinas picture is basically going to be a visual cue for you to remember a model of literacy development that we're going to use just a little bit throughout this whole thing. The point of it for you is to give you some structure and some organization related to all the activities that we'll do. So you're going to do a bunch of activities, but you'll find that when you're actually trying to do those in real life with real students who don't just necessarily catch on to it very quickly, you'll have to make decisions about when it's time to move on, when you need more of something else. And this model that we'll build off that St. Thomas Aquinas picture is meant to help you with that. At first, that won't be very clear to you how it can, but it does help over time. That St. Thomas Aquinas picture, if you could lay that flat on your desk, because we're going to put other pieces of paper, little teeny pieces, on top of it for the moment. So if you could lay it flat and then take your little baggie and dump it out. All those little pieces that you're dumping out, it looks like you're turning them over right side up, which is great, so that you can see the printing on them. If you would look for the little pieces that have a circle, a little bubble, those are the main components of literacy development. So all the ones where there's a little circle around the words. So what are the words that you see for those?
Mental representations.
Yep. Yep. Mental representation, spoken language, and okay, great. So on the St. Thomas Aquinas picture, I'm going to ask you to take one of those three little components and place them on 3 different parts of the picture. Try to match them up with what makes sense. So the book, St. Thomas Aquinas' mouth, and his head. Which one of those 3 phrases would make most sense on the book? I can't hear anything, but probably somebody answered. Yes, very good. Which one would make most sense on his mouth? Yes, and on his head, that leaves mental representations. So all of literacy development is about making the connections between those 3 components. So remember the word components. Those are the 3 components. Try not to look at your diagram in front of you and just think about what are those 3 components. You can think of the picture. There's the book, the mouth, the head. What are the phrases that go on top of those? Oh, sorry, nothing new. We're just reviewing what you just did. Do you understand? Okay, so it didn't seem like it. All I'm doing is trying to help you remember right now what those 3 components are, like to start getting them into your memory. So you've just looked at them, and now just try to look away and remember. Yep. Yes. Yes. And written symbols. Very good. Okay. So now the next step is to think about what exactly are the different connections between these parts, and I'll help you through this. So you see on the rest of your little cards, there's a bunch of them with arrows on them. Would you pull out all the ones that have arrows, please? Those are the connections. This diagram kind of goes in rainbow order from the bottom to the top. So if you know rainbow order, that will help you. If you don't, it doesn't matter. But the written symbols at the bottom are red. And then the orange colored arrows will be coming up or going down toward that written symbols bubble. So look for the orange one that's called decoding. Decoding. When all of us as humans look at written symbols and turn them into spoken language, we're decoding. What's the other little phrase beneath decoding on that arrow? Sounding out? Or, oh no, it says word recognition. That's what the REC stands for, word recognition. So, do you have it straight? If the connection between written symbols and spoken language is decoding with the arrow going up, that's the first step that a person needs to take when they're reading. They have to look at the symbols and turn them into language. And then they have to take that spoken language, and figure out what it means. That's the mental representation part. That's the same skill that we use when we're listening to other people. So if you find the arrow that's listening comprehension, that is the facing up, the second half of what we do when we're reading. So now if you could find the big long arrow that says reading, and just place that to the left of your, on the left side of the St. Thomas Aquinas picture. If your other little arrows are not already kind of on the left, then would you move them over there? So the whole point of that part is that in order for a person to read, there are those three components that had to come first, and then the two connections that have to be made between those components. Does that make sense? Okay. And then there'll be some arrows going down the other side. If you could line those up on the right-hand side, look at your little arrows to find the one that says spoken composition. And put that going down from mental representation to spoken language. And then underneath that is the encoding arrow that goes down from spoken language down to written symbols. And then the big long writing arrow will go even to the right of all those, facing down. And so that's what's involved in writing. Each person has to start out with a mental representation, which is kind of an idea in their head of what they hope to express to someone else. Then they have to put words on that idea, turn it into spoken language. That's what we do when we're speaking or we're composing. And then we have to take those words and actually write them down on a page or use a typewriter. I mean, a computer. That's funny. Or some form of getting them written down. So does that make sense? At this point, really what this should just drive home to you is that literacy involves a lot of different components. And if a person is struggling, they could just be struggling with any one of these areas and the whole thing could fall apart. So what first has to be done is to identify where are the weaknesses so that we can strengthen those and get the whole system going. Make sense? Okay. So then the next set of handouts are a set of white pieces of paper, paper clipped together that have that St. Thomas Aquinas picture on the front. So it has all of those little, oh, I didn't finish the little parts with you, but that's okay. You've now seen the whole thing there. Hopefully it matches the way you had set up the colored parts in front of you. And you can see that the title is up there at the top. The Acquisition of Language and Literacy. Language comes first, very purposely, because in order for a person to learn to read and write a language, it's pretty crucial if they want to do as well as possible that they already have good fluency in speaking the language. So learning the language as a spoken thing first really helps to then transfer that to learning how to read and write it. there's 3 principles of this that are the only other kind of theory things we're going to do this whole time, and they're very short. We're only going to do one right now. And it is, the 3 principles are abbreviated CPR. So the C is that the components have to come before the connections. So components before connections. So that's kind of one of the things I was just saying, was that the language, the spoken language, which is like that bubble in the middle, that has to come before you can make connections between language and anything else. The only other little part of this that I want to emphasize right now before we go on to the activities are this, that spoken language middle bubble there is supposed to also emphasize the fact that as a person is learning to read and write, we really want them to use that spoken language part of their brain, that left side over there. So all these activities that you'll be doing, the point of them is that as he does them, he'll have to look at the written symbols. That's that little bubble on the bottom. He'll have to decode to turn it into spoken language. But then very crucially, and especially for those of you who haven't taught reading before, this is something to really, really remember, that just sounding something out gets a person a long way, but this is kind of phonics, that's the sounding out part. Most phonics programs and phonics approaches stop there. What we'll be doing is, after he has sounded out, every activity also requires him to go up to the last bubble at the top to get a picture in his mind, to connect to meaning. So that top bubble you could also just think of as meaning. So when a person is learning to read, a phonics approach is very good. It forces them to use the speech part of their brain. However, if all they do is get a connection, is kind of learn to use that speech part of their brain, but don't ever keep connected to meaning, which is here at the front of your brain, if they don't make that, then when they go to try to read a book, they may be able to sound out the words, but they're not in the habit of actually monitoring their own comprehension as they read. They're not in the habit of trying to understand what it is that they're sounding out. And so that's often a hard step to take. For somebody who struggles, that's often a big downfall. So that's something we'll be emphasizing. But that is something you need to have in your mind. That as you go, you're always doing all these steps from the bottom bubble, through the middle bubble, up to the top bubble. Symbols, speech, meaning. As you're doing that, can anybody name what's in the bottom bubble? Yes, written symbols, the book. And what's in the middle bubble? Great. And what's in the top bubble? Very good. Which is basically meaning. What do we call that connection between the book and the mouth? Yeah, you blanked out for a second. Great, decoding. Yep. And then the second connection up from the spoken language bubble to the mental. Yeah, I think you said listening comprehension. It's the same set of skills we use when we're listening to somebody. Even if, as we read, we don't read out loud, so we don't actually hear the language spoken. But ideally, we've activated the spoken language part of our brain and then pulled up the meanings of the words that we activated in our brain.